Today's horsepower is on a roll with a stock Buick Wagon, their newest project called Sucker Punch. They start with all-out chassis mods to make this thing ready for 800 turbocharged horsepower.
Hey, honk if you love station wagons. This one's a 1978 Buick Century, one of GM's last full-frame wagons. We're proud to say it's our newest project vehicle. Why? Well, first, we thought it'd make a perfect Mustang and Camaro killer in a plain brown wrapper. Also because, why not? As a rule, wagons are cool. Station wagons had some image issues during their peak years. In some TV commercials back then, it seemed the measure of a good wagon was how many kids it could haul. Hardly a young hot rodder's idea of a cool street machine. This 1929 Ford Model A is an early version of the station wagon. And what's not to love about those wonderful Woody versions? Like this piece of fine furniture on wheels from the 40s, soon to be treasured by surfers and termites. Jeep introduced America's first all-steel wagon in 1946. During the next 2 decades, the number of makes and models would soar. Turn a classic Bel Air into a show and shine entry, and it gets admiring stares from those who remember and those who don't. Nowadays, turn any wagon into a race car, and you get instant attention at the drag strip. What used to be a ho-hum hauler is now a novel, nostalgic hot rod.
You know what's funny? I cannot believe I'm in a station wagon, and I actually feel cool.
This 78 represents both the end of an era and the beginning of one of our wildest project car builds ever.
This thing has no get up and go.
No, it's very sad. It's very sad. That was actually to the floor.
Yeah.
Oh, what was that?
Weather stripping.
Oh. The body is in great shape, but the 34-year-old suspension?
Oh! All right, we're done.
There it goes.
It's been altered for this lowered stance, and not very well.
Oh, man, that was a hard one.
The guy who owned the car before obviously had too wide of a rear tire on.
This is where the tire caught the lip right here and it rolled it out.
Hopefully we'll get it back with air still in the tire.
Man, we're about to limp her home.
Or you could just finish it off.
Clearance did!
Man, we're good now. Both sides now.
Oh, I saw Joe fly.
But don't feel sorry for this wagon. We already ordered a high-performance suspension package from RideTech because this 110 horsepower 231 V6 will get replaced with a stroke 461-inch Pontiac. Topped off with a Turbonetics turbocharger, with mild boost, our goal is to make over 800 horsepower at the tire. The beauty of not reusing anything under here is being able to speed up the teardown process. Ever wonder how they got the ride height in this wagon? Well, here it is. The old school way, and pretty stupid. These clamps took half the purpose out of these springs. Now we know why chunks are missing out of the rear tires. Now we can unbolt the control arms and remove everything attached to the rear end, which is coming down for a replacement later on today. With it out of the way, we can finish back here removing the control arms and shocks. There she blows. Back up front, same goes. With the wheels removed, we can get to the factory sway bar. Then using various tools of persuasion, we can free up all the linkage and remove it. Next, we separate the steering column from the steering box so it can come out from the top. We have to remove 30 years of gunk just to get a wrench on the bolts holding the lower control arms in place. Eventually though, we can drop the shocks, use a chain around the springs to hold them in place for safety, and drop the arm and spindle together and pull out the original spring. Must have been out of the clamps though, so the old hot wrench was used. Kinda takes the good out of the good old days. Finally, each lower control arm, spindle, and rotor can come out as one big fat assembly, and our teardown's officially finished.
Oh, what was that? The weather stripping.
Oh. We're back at it. We showed you the wagon, how we destroyed the rear tires,
Both sides now.
And how it got that lowered stance. Here's the right way to lower a vehicle. This is RideTech's new coilover system for 78 through 88 GM G-bodies. Now, if you haven't noticed, the G-bodies are the last full-frame rear-wheel drive cars GM produced. They're readily available, cheap to buy, and you can find performance parts for them all over the place. Now, we're not going to talk about each part in the suspension system right now, but more about the terminology used with it. Some of the terms used when we talk about shocks is rebound and compression. Now, compression is the amount of force it takes to close the shock or compress it. Rebound is the amount of force it takes to open the shock or bring it back to its ride height position. Now, some of the other terms are single and double adjustable. This is a single adjustable, so the compression is preset at the factory, while we're able to control the rebound by this knob. They're usually in settings from 1 to 10, 1 being the softest, 10 being the hardest. Now, a double adjustable shock works the same way, but it controls both rebound and compression. One of the most overlooked yet most important components to the whole suspension system are the sway bars. If they're not made to match all the other components or the weight of the car, you're going to have a handling nightmare. Now, we got everything in this system to do all the rear suspension and everything up front. Now, some of you may notice this is some pretty beefy stuff, and there's good reason for that. We're going to be making over 1,100 foot-pounds of torque, so this rear end's got to handle it. Now, this is a custom Dana 60 from DTS. It uses one of their rear support covers, as well as a set of 456 gears and a spool. Now, the spool is going to allow both rear tires to turn at the same time and the same speed all the time. Now, this thing uses Timken bearings and seals throughout, as well as a chromoly 1350 yoke and straps. Now, to transfer the power from the spool to the tires are these massive 40-spline gun-drilled alloy axles. Now, they don't use a C-clip to hold them into the spool. They slide right into the spline, and they get retained to the axle housing with this bracket that also doubles as the caliper bracket. Attach the rear lower strong arms, making sure the sway bar holes are closest to the axle. Check out the strength of this coilover bracket. The adjustable uppers can go on, and notice the Kevlar lined heims. This will avoid any binding. Up on the frame, we can bolt up the upper coilover brackets in the existing holes. Make sure to apply a little lithium grease to all the urethane bushings. Now, using the trans jack, we can raise the rear end as an assembly and make our connections. Make sure to leave all the bolts loose until all of the arms are in place. This will make lining up the control arms with the frame a lot easier. The rear coilovers use a 200-pound spring, a whole lot different from what we took out. Even though it's a pre-fit, it's important to tighten everything up. Now, never use air tools or over-torque any of these connections. This thing has several parts that are designed to move. Over-tightening can cause premature bushing failure and severe suspension binding. To wrap it up, the rear muscle bar sway bar gets bolted to the lower control arms.
Sweet.
We didn't need to re-drill any holes or cut and modify any of the pieces. Keep in mind, this was a custom axle housing as well. It just goes to show how good things can fit if the engineering is thought out. We'll see how the front goes together in a minute.
Horsepower's back after beefing up our wagon's back end with a DTS axle assembly, spool, and set of 456 gears. We gave it coilover shocks, upper and lower control arms, and a muscle car sway bar. And not to waste any time, we're already on the case filling up the front end with suspension pieces. For control arms, we just installed more strong arm upper and lowers from RideTech. Even though we're using a coilover system, these lowers are the same ones used with the Shockwave air springs. Now, our coilover springs are rated at 900 pounds, and they're a single adjustable design. And that gets us to the spindles and brakes that just came in from SSBC, all made in the USA. Now, these 2-inch drop spindles will house a pair of big bite 13-inch cross-drilled and slotted rotors and a pair of 3-piston tri-power calipers that use these premium Hawk pads. Now, we had our calipers painted black for a reason. That's to go with that stealthy, subdued sleeper look.
Just like the rear, we can adjust the ride height of the car using the coilover, but there's a certain area the stroke of the shock needs to be in to maintain that ride performance. So instead of doing it in here, we're going to do it with this 2-inch drop spindle. Now, this thing was designed for an S10, and it's been machined by SSBC to accept all the brakes. Plus, it's a lot better than melting a spring. Now, we can pack the rear bearing with grease. and using the supplied seal, knock it into place in the rotor. Then the rotor goes onto the spindle, followed by the front bearing, washer, and nut. Install a cotter pin and pop on the dust cover.
Then we can slide those new SSBC calipers onto the rotors and add these stock type banjo fittings. We're using a 3-piece muscle bar sway bar made for G-bodies. It's way stronger than stock, designed to work specifically with the lower strong arms, and it's a direct bolt-in. Anytime you add weight to the front end of a vehicle, well, like with an engine swap in our case, it's always a good idea to take some off as well. And a good way to do that is with a rack and pinion kit, like this manual kit from TRZ Motorsports. It comes with a Flaming River rack, plus all these accessories you'll need to keep it in place. Now, you have to do some welding. In addition to losing weight, though, you'll also get a better feel for the road and prevent bump steer. Here are the supplied brackets from the kit you'll be welding. Here's what you're going to be welding them to.
The front suspension is at ride height thanks to a pair of screw jacks. We can position the rack, making sure it is as high as possible, but not to interfere with the oil pan. We're going a little higher than the top of the engine crossmember. With a level on the top of the rack, make sure it's even. With the mounting plate attached to the rack, we can tack it in place. Making sure it's squared up, we can begin to cut the mounting tube for the other side. Remember, this setup is foreign to this chassis, so there's no existing holes or template to work from.
All right, looking good.
The instructions are helpful, but common sense and lots of measuring will get you there. Once you're happy, finish it off. To attach the rack to the steering column, we need to cut some holes in the frame for the steering shaft to pass through. We're using a 2-inch hole saw. With that tackled, we'll have to wait till the engine is in to make sure we clear our headers. To finish it now could result in a lot of extra work then.
Well, here are the finishing touches for the front of the wagon. For wheels, we wanted something cool but subdued enough for a sleeper, so we went with these Rocket Booster Hyper Shots from Rocket Racing, 18x9s front and back. Now, for front rubber, though, we went with the Nitto 245 4018s, but can't put them on just yet. We got more work to do out back coming up.
We're back, but not done yet. Now here's the reasons we pre-fit all the rear suspension. The first one's pretty obvious, to make sure everything fit. With all this extra heavy hardware, the old G-body chassis is going to need some updates. It's kind of like trying to keep a bull in a chicken coop. We needed to see where we had clearance to do some serious torque box and frame stiffening, like right here. Where the upper control arm bolts to the frame. Now notice how thin this metal is. The first time the tires really hook, that can get ripped out. Now here on the lower arm, where it attaches to the torque box, this thing is only welded in a few spots and there's plenty of open areas. So we're gonna go ahead and plate all that in and it'll be super strong as well. We're also gonna run a tube from the frame rail to the frame rail right through here, which will stiffen it up, but we're also gonna have a drop in it right here that'll double as our drive shaft loop. These cross braces are pretty weak too, so we'll cut these out and replace it with stronger material. Using a wheel spacer to act as a rotor, we need to throw on the rear wheels and check for clearance. With a trans jack under the rear end, unbolt the rear shocks from the housing and let them hang. Now by pumping the jack, we're raising the tire into the fender well. Once we have the rear at ride height, rotate the tire and check for proper clearance all the way around. Everything looks good from the front of the wheel well all the way to right here. We've got 1/4 of an inch. If we end up rubbing, a hammer will take care of it. This car has a tapered wheel well, which makes tire fitment an issue. Now we did our homework and it shows. To make room for the fab work, I'm lowering the rear end and unbolting the upper control arms from the chassis. This will let the rear end hang fairly low and out of the way. Using a piece of cardboard, I'm making a template to fit the upper control arm mount. Now once fitted, we'll mark the location of the bolt hole. Using 3/16 steel plate, trace the template onto it. Notice the 2 raised tabs coming off the plate now? We'll keep watching. Now John is prepping the areas to be welded, making sure they're free from any chassis coating or oil. Now back to those tabs from earlier. With a slicer wheel, I'm cutting slots in the plate so they will bend easier. With it in a vise, I'll bend the tabs, test fit it, clean up the edges, and drill 1 more hole for the bolt, and a few more for plug welds. Bolt the plate to the control arm mount and snug it up. Now tack the plate in place, and make sure the tabs are flush with the frame. The tabs are to strengthen the plate and improve its side load. The last thing to do is weld the holes in so there will be no flexing between the two. Repeat on the other side. After cleaning the lower control arm mounts and making some more templates, John is cutting some notched plates out of the same steel plate. The plate is recessed to fit into the control arm mount, giving us more areas to weld. With the plate level, I can tack it in place on the top and bottom, then weld it in. Its twin goes in next, followed by the same steps. To bridge the two, we'll make a template to cut out a piece of 3/16 plate, tack it and weld it in as well. One more piece will be used to box it all in.
That'll be it.
A new crossbar is next. Using 1 5/8 120 wall tubing and our tube shark bender, we made a 45-degree bend, and by flipping it over, another two 25-degree bends on both sides.
Okay.
Let's see what we've got. Hold
First
this up
in.
against that inner side. No, against the frame rail.
Right there, okay. So we're gonna bend this and put them right there?
Yep, right
All right.
into the boxes. It looks like the radius is gonna be perfect up in this
That looks
area.
good, yeah.
What we need to do is we're gonna do the bend before we cut. That way we
Okay.
don't come up short.
Making sure the tube is level and flat with the other bends, we'll go 37 degrees. Give it another test fit to make sure the angle is enough.
Oh, that'll work.
That's gonna be perfect.
Bend the other side, cut it to length on the cold saw, and weld it in place. To finish off the bar, we'll bend the lower portion of the loop, notch the ends to fit the tube circumference, and weld it in too. The final pieces for the rear are the 1.5-inch tubes used to tie the upper control arm mounts to the frame rail for added strength and to keep them in place. All that work to help us handle over 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. I'm really happy with all this fab work. Now once we get the drivetrain in the car, we're gonna do some more bracing and tube work in the center and very front of the car. Now this not only improves the strength, but also the handling. Now for those of you that plan on getting a G-body or already have one, and you're gonna put some big power to the rear, you guys have to do this. If you don't, you're gonna be sorry.